All right, class, you're my fifth graders, and today we're going to be learning about the Baroque period. Now, so Baroque means fancy, right? So what kind of thing do you think distinguishes the Baroque period, if it means fancy, right?
Fancy instruments, maybe?
Yeah, that's part of it. So the instruments started to get more complicated during the Baroque period. Anything else?
Maybe how they dressed?
That's true. So the Baroque period is not just classical music as a whole, from Baroque all the way up through Romantic, is considered classical music. But then there's also the specific classical period. So the Baroque period of music was also a time of historical Baroqueness. So the architecture was very fancy, the clothes were very fancy, the music was very fancy. Some of the other things that they started to do at this time was they put music into keys. Have you ever heard of having music in a key? No? So music in a key is when you have a specific set of those black notes on the piano that you play every time it comes up. So they don't have to note that it's a sharp or a flat. It's just noted right in the piece of music that this is going to be a sharp note every single time you play it. And so most pieces of music nowadays are set in a certain key. And this is the period where they first started to do that. Some of the famous composers from this period are Bach, is the most famous composer. And we're going to listen to a piece of music by Bach called Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring. It's a very famous piece. You might have heard it before. Let's see if we can get this going. And when I play this, I want you to listen and see, is this connected to the internet? It is. Why is this not coming up? There we go. Okay, see if you can hear anything that sounds fancy to you. So did that sound like it had some fancy parts in it? Yeah. This is.
I think the piano's very fancy sounding.
That's true. Unfortunately, most of Bach's pieces of music were not originally written for the piano because the piano hadn't been invented yet.
Interesting.
Yes, a lot of the pieces of music that you hear played on the piano, like this one, were either written for the clavicle, which was it's similar to a piano. It's set up with a keyboard the same way, but the way it worked is that it plucked at the strings instead of having a hammer that hit the strings. And so the sound, it didn't sound quite as good. They hadn't quite invented the piano yet. And then a lot of his other pieces were written for the organ, because actually during Bach's life, he was not very famous as a composer. He was more well known as an organist, because his whole job was to write organ pieces and then play them at a church or for a noble. I think he did both of those things. And so his work was actually all put in boxes and put in a closet for 100 years after he passed away. And then somebody found them and went, wow, this is really good music. And they pulled all that out, and we learned more about Bach, and that's how he became famous. So the other thing about Bach is that I've totally forgotten what I was going to say. His ability, oh yes, that's right. The reason that the Baroque period is in the time that it is that the Baroque period ends with the death of Bach. So Bach dies in 1650, or 17, sorry. It goes from 1600 to 1750. And 1750 is right when Bach died, and so that is commonly the end of the Baroque period. And the reason for this is that later on, so he wasn't really famous during the time, but they didn't actually call it the Baroque period then. This is something that we've gone back and done as historians later on. And so they said, oh, well, Bach is the most famous and the most important composer of this time. So when he dies, that's when we'll change it over to the classical period. All right, so we're going to learn about some other kinds of music, or the pieces of music that they started to do during the Baroque period. One of those is an oratorio. And an oratorio is a large-scale musical work for an orchestra, which is a lot of different instruments all together, or for voice. And this is performed kind of as a narrative, but they don't have any costumes, they don't have any scenery, they don't have any action. So like an opera would be a bunch of people standing around singing, but they would get dressed up in costumes and they'd have a show that they were doing. And an oratorio is something before they really had opera, or they didn't really want to dress up in costumes, but they would play the music and they'd have some voices in there, but it wouldn't be a play. And so the most famous one of these is called Handel's Messiah, and it is the Hallelujah chorus of Handel's Messiah. And here we go. This is Handel's Messiah. We're going to listen specifically the Hallelujah chorus. There we go. Okay, why do you think it was called the Hallelujah chorus?
Because they said hallelujah.
Because they said hallelujah a lot. Exactly, that's right. So Handel that's his most famous work, but he had a lot of other things. And so Handel was a very interesting person. He was born in Germany, but then he moved to England, and he spent all of his life in England. Well, not all of his life, but a lot of his career was spent in England, where he made a lot of English music. And so that's why most of these things that you'll hear are not going to be, if there's any words, which most of them don't have it, but the words won't be in English, because this is pretty much the only composer that we're dealing with that is spent some time in England. Most of them are from different countries. Bach was from Austria. Handel was from Germany, but he lived in England. And then we're going to go on to Vivaldi, and he was in Italy. And so Vivaldi was a person who was a priest for a while, and he spent a lot of time at a girls' school. So orphaned girls would go to this school, and they'd teach them, and they'd raise them, kind of like an orphanage for girls. And so he was very famous for all of his violin pieces. And this is Vivaldi's Four Seasons, which is one of his most famous works. We're going to listen to a little bit of this. All right, so he's most famous for his violin. Have you ever heard that piece before?
Yes.
Yeah? Almost everybody's heard it. Almost everybody's heard a lot of these pieces because they're all very famous, are the ones I've chosen. All right, so a concerto is another type of piece of music that we're going to learn a little bit about. We're going to hear another piece by Bach called the Brandenburg Concerto. He wrote a bunch of these. This is the first one. And the difference between a concerto and other pieces of music is that a concerto is usually focused on a single instrument or a single voice. Maybe it's a group of those instruments, but they're all going to be playing the same thing. And so this is Bach's Brandenburg Concerto. And let's see if we can tell what instrument he's focusing on in this. So there's two kinds of instruments that are playing in that. Could you tell anything about what they were?
Is it woodwinds?
Woodwinds. So, well, yes. So that was the wind instruments that we're playing. And there's one other type.
Strings.
Strings. That's right. Probably violins. I'm not 100% sure. All right. So we are going to have a quick quiz. I have some of the vocabulary that we've gone over. And you guys are going to match the composers or the piece of music to the description of them. There we go. All right, and we're going to take a couple minutes. Shouldn't take you too long. Let's see. Anybody have any questions or any comments about these? Anything they need some help with? No? Okay. That is the end of my lesson. So if you guys have any comments.
Yeah, I like this. I think this is good because then they can like do it and then like take it home and it can be like they're like when your parents ask you like, oh, what did you do today? You'd be like, oh, well, I learned about Baroque and how that's a term that means fancy. Like that's really cute.
Mm-hmm.
And then I like how you had like music to go along with every composer that you talked about. I thought that was important, especially with music. Like,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
'Cause it's like, who are they without what they did?
you know.
Right.
So, great job.
Thank you.
I think your teaching overall was just like, it was intriguing. Like you had a lot of like different fun facts. So if I was a fifth grader, I think that'd be really cool. I would have liked to seen like visuals. That's just like, you know,
Right.
the type of student I am.
Mhm.
Just like, I loved hearing the music, but being able to put a face to the person composing that music, I think that'd be
Right.
really awesome.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also hard in this.
But it's
setting.
also hard setting exactly. So yeah, but it was good.
Okay. Thank you very much. All right.